Previously, he held a Gold Harvard Distinguished Fellow position at Brookhaven National Laboratories in the United States and received a PhD from University of Arizona. He has brought interest in ecosystem, ecology, plant physiology, climate change, mitigations, and sustainability sciences. He is using an integrated approach, GIS, remote sensing, AI, numerical modeling, domain knowledge, etc., to study these topics with goals to improve the way people experience, understand, and appreciate our living planet, and to inspire actions for sustaining our natural and managed ecosystems. He has published over 60 peer-reviewed papers, including Science, Nature, and is currently an associate editor of remote sensing in ecology and conservation. Over the years, hyperspectral remote sensing has become an increasingly important tool for agronomy research. In the following presentation, Hyperspectral Remote Sensing in Agroecosystems by Professor Jin Wu, he will give a brief overview of this technology in agroecosystems, primarily focusing on the following 4 questions. What is it? Why would it work? What is the current status? And what is the future trend? Okay, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Jin Wu to the stage. Okay, Professor Wu, please.
Thanks so much, Professor Lang, for your really great introduction. And also really appreciate all this great opportunity and also platform. So I think that will be a really good opportunity for me to interact with other agriculture scientists here, and also someone will watch the video later on. So so probably we can start now here. And also thank you everyone for joining. So the talk title today is Hyperspectral Remote Sensing in Agroecosystems. And here is a brief CV about me, and I think Professor just mentioned. But one thing I would like to highlight here is before I joined Hong Kong U, and especially if you see here, you can tell I have a quite interdisciplinary background before, kind of like received GIS in undergraduate, later on remote sensing. And during my PhD, I started to touch the ecology and evolution topic. And currently my lab research will primarily focus on forest ecology and plant physiology. And over the years, we have been developing quite like the integrated technique, including remote sensing and modeling approach to study this kind of topic. And I hope my past background using remote sensing in forest ecology can be insightful for some regular agriculture research as well. But frankly speaking, I'm still layman to the agriculture field. So I really appreciate this opportunity and try to learn more from you all, and also probably more collaboration in the future as well. And here shows the general outline for today's talk. Primarily will cover the 4 questions like Professor Lam just mentioned. And first, let us jump into the 4 things is the remote sensing. And remote sensing, by definition, is the science and art of obtaining information about an object, areas, or phenomena through the analysis of data acquired by a device without any direct contact. In other words, remote sensing, by definition, is acquired information without direct contact or remodeling, right? And one example about remote sensing, probably close to our daily life, probably is the cell phone the camera in building the cell phone, right? Our cell phone camera. With our cell phone camera, we can almost record every beautiful moment in our daily life. So now imagine if you have the cell phone, quite similar like the cell phone camera, but mounted in a drone, in an airplane, and even to the satellite, right? So you can also record the information in different like the platform. So according to the camera sensors distant to the object, then we can also divide remote sensing into the near surface remote sensing, airborne remote sensing, and even to the satellite remote sensing. And fundamentally, for all remote sensing data, no matter which platform they have, and normally they originate from a measurement of the electromagnetic spectrum. And the cartoon below summarizes the three major interaction pathway between the electromagnetic spectrum and an object. So including when the light beam hit an object, sunlight will be reflected, and sunlight will be absorbed by the object, and the sound will transmit it through the object. And for most of remote sensing sensor, including our cell phone camera, normally record the energy reflected by the object. So that's how the remote sensing data was recorded. And one really important terminology in the remote sensing field, especially when we interpret remote sensing data, is about resolution. And normally there are at least 3 dimensions of the resolution issues here. The first dimension is called a spatial resolution. It refers to the dimension of an image pixel. Take this image as an example. And from here, the image, the resolution is called 0.5 meters. So it means 1 pixel in this image, it corresponds to 0.5 by 0.5 square meters in the real world. And the next figure is the 1 meter resolution, and as such until to 20 meter resolution. And based on this kind of time series, this kind of image series, and we can tell, right? If a satellite image, if a remote sensing image, if it has a high spatial resolution, normally it means we can see the object really clearly, right? But when we go to the coarse resolution, normally means some like the fundamental object, it probably will be mixtured together, right? Even in one remote sensing image pixels. So that means high resolution of spatial resolution can be matters when we interpret some object in the lens surveys. And the second dimension of the resolution is called the temporal resolution. It refers to the frequency of repeated image records. So, take this image stack as an example. It refers to the image taken at the daily time scale. That means almost for the lens surveys, the remote sensing sensor will record at least 1 image per day, right? So then it can have really high frequent data in this image stack. Alternatively, some remote sensing sensor, they probably will record the same lens surveys at the monthly intervals. So then the resolution will be at a monthly time scale. And why resolution can be matters? Because if we have the image recorded frequently, that means even there's some rapid change in the lens surveys that can also be seeded by the remote sensing data. And take like the agricultural system as an example. We know for some crop systems, there are some certain typical phenotypes, right? Like when the crop started to emerge with new leaf, and then when they reach to the peak growth status, and even the timing of the flowering, something like this. And all these kind of critical phenotypes, sometimes it happened only at a really short time intervals. So the high frequent temporal resolution will be really important to monitor such change. And the third dimension of the resolution, it will touch to the spectral resolution. That's also the key things we want to talk today. And the spectral refers to the resolution of each spectral band recorded in the remote sensing data. And normally we can divide according to the spectral resolution and also number of the spectrum in remote sensing data, we can divide into the multispectral remote sensing data and hyperspectral remote sensing data. And the cartoon here give you some general example. For example, like a digital camera, like the cell phone camera, right? It's a typical type of a digital camera. It's kind of a way to mimic our human eye to see the world. So normally for the digital camera, it will record the image in the 3 spectral band because red, green, and blue band. The reason for this is because red, green, blue are the 3 primary colors for the visible world. So that means if we have record the data in the RGB format, then with the random combination of them, like light intensity, then we can also almost mimic all given colors our naked eye can see in the world. So that's the reason we also call red, green, blue as the 3 primary colors. So then we can use the 3 band, almost can mimic all different colors in the world. And like a digital camera, because it only has a 3 spectral band and also only cover the visible light range, normally this belongs to, we classify this as the multispectral band remote sensing data. And on the right panel is a hyperspectral sensor that's a specialized camera. We can also see the landscape, and then we can also zoom into deep, like the pixels, and then we can see it in a way, and we found it can be represent like a high dimensional, right, data queue, right, like high dimensional data queue. And then for even for one pixel, if we see it in a like the two-dimensional way, x-axis is a spectral wavelength, like a different spectral band, and y-axis is the reflectance signals, and you can see it will represent very similar like a curve, right, like a beautiful curve. So one thing about the hyperspectral remote sensing, it has some important features here. One is the spectral resolution are much finer compared with the multispectral band, like the multispectral data. And the secondly, they often have a really high dimension of the spectral data. And also sometimes they can cover wider light range, including both the visible light and also sometimes can go beyond the visible light. And now if we zoom in to see the hyperspectral remote sensing definition here, it highlights a couple things. One is acquire digital imagery of a surface in many narrow and continuous spectral. That means it not only need to have a really fine spectral resolution, but at the same time, they need to be a continuous, right? Continuous across a wide range of the spectral regime. So that will be defined as the hyperspectral remote sensing data. So what we can gain from the high spectral resolution remote sensing data. And here, I want to show you examples. Imagine now we have a hyperspectral camera, and we can mount it in the airplane, and then we can fly through a landscape, right? And then we can also divide the object into different components, like the atmosphere, soil, and water. And then we can also analyze the spectral reflectance across a wide range of spectral wavelength from 400 nanometer until to 2,500 nanometers. That's the reflectance spectral shows. And we can clearly see different objects. Their spectral reflectance are totally different. That on one hand to say, we can easily use hyperspectral remote sensing to differentiate one lane cover type to the other lane cover type in a really easy and also efficient way. But at the same time, there are a lot of really detailed information. For example, even like a vegetation show here, like a plant. Their spectral EV can survey a lot of different vegetations, and you can see overall vegetation shows quite similar patterns, but there's still some internal variability across different vegetation type survey from different plant or different growth environment. So, and a lot of scientific research evidence now also shows using the hyperspectral data from vegetation, can also enable us to quantify some like internal biochemical and structure and functional composition of leaf and plant canopies, and by which we can infer their health and also functional status. And to help you to understand this, and here is an example demonstrations. Imagine now if we have a hyperspectral reflection data, we collect across the global plant, right? Like some colleague collect data from Arctic, some colleague collect data from tropical, and some colleague collect from the crop. And if you combine all these kind of data together, it will look like this. X is the spectral wavelength of the remote sensing data, and y-axis is the hyperspectral like a reflectance. And overall, you can tell at least two things here. No matter what kind of plant, they almost shows a quite similar reflectance patterns over the entire spectral wavelength. And secondly, if you zoom in to see each spectral wavelength, for example, like 1,000 nanometers wavelength, and normally you can see there's a large variability across different plants. So what does that mean? That means on the one hand, we definitely can easily tell the vegetation apart from others, but at the same time, it also gives us a lot of opportunity to understand about the internal property of the plants. For example, like the pigments, cell structure, and water content, and so on. And one thing I also want to highlight, for example, if we now just take a look about the spectral wavelength here, normally we can also divide it into different range, and they correspond to different meanings. Visible light, that's our naked eye can see, it corresponds to the spectral range normally from 400 nanometer until to 700 nanometer. And because we know visible light are really important for plant photosynthesis, right? So the long-term evolution strategy for plant to evolve the strategy to for this kind of region actually are quite sensitive to the chlorophyll absorptions. And then for the for for the shortwave infrared, and a lot of evidence also suggests they are quite sensitive to the leaf water content. And in between, like the near infrared, because that also represents a lot of sunlight energy, but plant normally will not use this kind of energy for photosynthesis. So most of plant evolve the strategy to reflect all this kind of energy out. So that's the reason the near infrared normally have a really high spectral reflectance values. And they are also really sensitive to the cell structure and also the thickness of leaf. Normally, if we have a leaf, they are really thick. Normally, they can also reflect higher energy in this region. And now, if you go beyond from a single leaf to entire like canopy, right, like a tree, normally how many layers of leaf sometimes also can contribute to this. If you have a higher layer of leaf, normally this value also can be really high. So that means even if you see a spectral response curve, normally a lot of underlying biochemical and biophysical property can be embedded. That also provide some quantitative way for us to understanding the biophysical processes. And here give you an example is how we can infer the chlorophyll concentration from the hyperspectral remote sensing data. So for example, on the left panel, it shows how the light absorption rate of chlorophyll A and B change with the spectral wavelength. And from here, you can see no matter chlorophyll A and B, they have the peak absorption rate in blue light and also the red light. On right panel is the spectral reflectance connect in the field. And the outer line shown here is the correspond to the yellow leaf with really low chlorophyll concentration. That means very little light was absorbed, visible light was absorbed by the plant. So you can see the reflectance value are normally really high, right? And then, but for internal line, like the dark leaf, they have really rich chlorophyll concentration. That means most of the light will be absorbed by the plant. And then the reflectance values actually overall are really low. And based on this, we can also see, we can develop some models to monitor how the chlorophyll concentration can correspond to the reflectance change. So if we can inverse these kind of models, then we can also accurately predict the infer the chlorophyll information based on the spectral measurement. And one thing probably you can already realize, even for the leaf reflectance spectral show across the large range, and normally they have really low value in the blue light and also really low reflectance values in the red light, but in the green light here, normally have a slightly peak, right, for the leaf reflectance. So that's the reason, because most of the leaf, if they green leaf, if they have a higher chlorophyll concentration, and the blue light and red light almost are used up for photosynthesis, and then really low reflectance was emerged. And also because they have radial higher reflectance in the green light, so that also explains why most of leaf look in green colors, right? And here is another example to show how we can infer the leaf water content from the hyperspectral reflectance. Like on the left panels, that's the dashed line show here. It refers to the absorptance of leaf water waters along with the spectral wavelength. And we can tell in the shortwave infrared range, most of the across this range and water can absorb more than 40% for most of this kind of spectral range. So now if we apply to the real world, as shown on the right panels, and you can see like the outer line show here, normally that means that these leaves are really dry, almost without any water content. And you can see in a shortwave infrared range, normally they have really high shortwave infrared reflectance. But with the increasing of the leaf water content, there's a sharp decrease of the shortwave infrared reflectance. So that also suggests with the hyperspectral reflectance informations, we can also accurately infer leaf water content as well. And beyond the two examples we just mentioned, like the pigment and also water content, we can infer from the hyperspectral remote sensing data. And in theory, more data actually also can be inferred, like the carbon, like a leaf mass per area as an indicator of the thickness of leaf morphology trait and carbon nutrient and so on. And so that means if we have the hyperspectral data, we can also characterize the canopy in a chemical way, right? And the interesting is dating back to more than 10 years ago, when Greg Asner, who is a professor from Stanford University, organized a big team of scientists to visit the Amazon rainforest. So they can survey each individual tree, as shown here, like a character represent different trees. And they can also survey their chemical composition for each trees. And they show the result here. And we can see if we see the plant in a chemical way, right? Different plant not only valid in their chemical concentrations, but the relative composition also valid significant from one species to the other species. This means if for our human beings, everyone has a quite unique fingerprint, right? And then we can using the fingerprint to differentiate one person from the other person. And if we can see plant in a chemical way, each plant also have a quite unique chemical fingerprint. And if hyperspectral remote sensing has the potential to characterize the plant in a chemical way, that also means we can potentially differentiate them one from the other from the space. So to test this idea, Greg Asner and also Stanford University, they developed this kind of called a Carnegie Airborne Observatory technique. So in this technique, they kind of install the specialized hyperspectral remote sensing sensor. And when they fly through the entire Amazonian forest, they found they indeed can tell different species apart and map the plant in a chemical composition way. So that proof this concept can be potentially applied to the real world. So with this as a general background to give you a general ideas about the hyperspectral remote sensing and some really important information potentially can be checked from the hyperspectral remote sensing. And next, I will try to give you some detailed example to see how this technique overall work in the field. And the example I use here is the plant photosynthesis. And we know plant photosynthesis can be important because for multiple fields, right? For agriculture field, photosynthesis is an important process for plant to assimilate CO2 and later on to important process to be relevant to the crop yield, right? And provide food to feed a lot of organisms like human beings and also other organisms. But at the same time, if we see it more broadly, like the natural ecosystem, plant photosynthesis also are really important. Nowadays, I think global warming has a big concern for most of people's actually global-wide issues nowadays. And we know CO2, like the carbon dioxide, is a really important greenhouse gases, right? And driving the global warming. And if we can better understand about the plant photosynthesis strategy, that means we can potentially use the plant photosynthesis to help reduce the CO2 level from the atmosphere and then to help to mitigate the climate change. So that's the reason photosynthesis potentially can be really important for multiple fields, not only for agricultural scientists, but also for the ecologists as well. So here I use the plant photosynthesis as an example. And normally from the modeling perspective of photosynthesis, now we already have some like the mathematical model to describe the photosynthesis processes. And a very popular model nowadays commonly used in the ecology field is called the Farquhar photosynthesis models. And in these models, and we can tell there's a really important biochemical trait that short for Vmax, and normally is refers to a maximum carboxylation capacity. And why these parameters are really important? Because for any kind of plants, if we know the Vmax and plus the environment, and we can use this kind of like a model to simulate the photosynthesis dynamic almost in a near real time, not only at a leaf level and also at a canopy scale. So that's the reason these parameters actually are fundamental to nowadays a large scale like the models to simulate the vegetation response to the climate change. So if these parameters are really important, so how can we monitor? So one thing, when we try to monitor and we realize this can be a lot of challenge than we thought. One thing, for example, like the figure shown on the left panel, it just record for a tree species surveyed from a Canadian temperate forest. Even within the same forest and all these trees, they expose nearly the same environment, all canopy trees. But if we just have a snapshot, for example, like 210 days of the year, and you can see different species, the Vmax also have really large variation. And of course, the season, along with the leaf age development, right? Leaf aging process, like leaf developmental processes. And we can tell Vmax can also vary largely across the season. So if available are so important, but at the same time, they are highly dynamic. So that will make a lot of challenging to us, right, science community. And alternatively, even if we just zoom in, for example, standardize the leaf age effect and just focus on tropical region, they are all the tropical evergreen forest. They have all year humid and high temperature like Hong Kong. But you can tell across different tropical forests, this variable can also have large variation. So variables are so important, but it can vary with species, genotype, leaf age, growth environment. So it will create a lot of challenging for us to monitor, right? And alternatively, we also cannot survey all the trees in the world, right? So because this can be a really challenging and a monitoring problem. So at the beginning, we already introduced the hyperspectral remote sensing technique. So then during my past research, we would like to ask whether the vegetation spectroscopy can be a potential way to solve this kind of like the monitoring problem or not, especially whether we can characterize the risk mass variability across different species, growth environment, and also leaf age. So we address these kind of questions in different way. The first one we would like to test is the seasonal cycle. For example, just focus on the same vegetation biome like a tropical forest, and whether this kind of technique can be an efficient and also scalable approach to monitor the physiological trait variation across the season or not. So to do that, during my PhD and postdoc, I visited 2 sites in Panama and also 1 site in Brazil, Brazilian Amazon. And then at the same time, we also hire some tree climber so they can climb to the top of tree and bring the leaf sample to the ground. And with the leaf sample in the ground, we can use the like a LICO gas exchange system to measure the CO2 response curve. And from leaves, we can derive the Vmax, which is an indicator of leaf photosynthetic capacity. At the same time, and once we finish the leaf samples with the LICO, and later on, we can also use a specialized equipment called a spectral radiometer so that we can measure the leaf level hyperspectral reflectors, like the example shown here. And the question here is whether we can, now if we have the hyperspectral measurement, then it almost take like 1 minute, we can almost survey one leaf. But if we're using the conventional approach like a LICO, it will take almost 40 minutes or even longer to survey one ACI curve so that we can derive Vmax. So the question here is whether the hyperspectral remote sensing technique, as shown on the right panel, can replace the conventional approach or not. So with the pair measurement of both the physiology trait like Vmax and also the hyperspectral measurement from the field. So the primary approach model we are using to solve this problem is using the partial least square regression approach. It's a statistic model. And if you're interested, I also have a slide I can help to explain later on. So here shows some result. The first, I would like to give you some example about how leaf aging in the Amazon forest. For example, in the Amazon, we surface more than 10 species. And then for each species, we can tag some leaf so we can track how they monitor how they live aging in nature, right? So for example, even for the same species we tag and at least leaf at 10 days old until to 360. At the same time, we continue to collect leaf and bring to a lab, we can measure their hyperspectral reflectors. And in our 2016 papers in Science, and we found leaf age are really important, really similar like the human beings, right? From like the infant until to like the mature and when we become older, our metabolic rate also can have a really large relation. And we found the plant also have a similar way. And at least when you scale up all this kind of fine scale information together with the leaf aging processes in the entire forest community, that are really important to determine the entire ecosystem scale of functioning performance. But no matter what, the age can be a really important indicator of the quality of a leaf, including the Vmax. And in this paper, one thing we collect this kind of unique data set, and also we demonstrate we can use hyperspectral remote sensing approach to monitor the leaf age, like precise, like if you have one leaf, using our model, we can exactly predict what's the age of our leaf leaf. And on the middle panels, we also found using the data, the spectral data we collect from not only in Amazon, Brazilian Amazon, but also in Panama, we also later on found if we can just develop a single spectral model, and then it can capture all the vulnerability of the risk mass, no matter it was induced by different forest site, and that represents slightly variation in the growth environment, especially associated with the soil properties. And also the age development process like mature and immature. For example, if a leaf are before like 30 days old, then we just assign them as an immature, right? So we found a single model can capture all the sources of vulnerability in the tropical region, either associated with the species, leaf aging, and also the growth environment associated with the site. The model actually are quite good. The X here in Infer is a spectral predict risk max, and Y-axis indicate is the likely derived risk max, which used as the ground benchmark. And the follow on the right, the last panels on the right, if we can use the spectral to predict the leaf, to infer the leaf age, at the same time we can also infer the risk map from the regular spectral measurement. And when we overlay them together, like the gray colors, just based on the spectral model, spectral models, it can almost monitor how the risk max changing along with the leaf age entire cycle, right? Entire leaf age cycles of the plants. And the red color shown here is the field observation data. And overall, the spectral model only also can check quite well with the field observation. There's some deviation in the late development stage of the plant, especially when they after the 200 days. And that primarily is because we have really limited data in this condition to constrain the model. So there's some room to improve, but at least it demonstrates this technique has a really high potential to replace the LICO as a more efficient way to monitor the plant physiology trait. So after I finished my postdoc in the United States, and when I moved to the Hong Kong U, and then my team is also try to see it, to move beyond this kind of field, to see whether we can go beyond the seasonal cycle in the tropical region, but also how about this, whether this kind of technique can be applied across different biomes, for example. And motivated by this kind of things, and my postdoc, Zhen Yan, during that time, organized a field campaign across the 3 different forest sites in mainland China, including Mountain Chanbai. That's at the high latitude, it's a really cold temperate region, until to the Mountain Dinghu in Guangdong, that's in the subtropical region, and also Xilongbana in Yunnan, that's a tropical rainforest. And we try to see whether this kind of technique can be used once it was calibrated, whether it can work across different vegetative biomes, especially they have different living zone. And the result, to our surprise, actually work really well. Is using a single models actually can predict all the physiological trait vulnerability across all the vegetative biome, even they have really large living environment difference. And during that time, I also collaborated with my colleague Carl Banaki and also Kathleen both from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and to see whether the same technique can be applied to the agricultural ecosystem or not. So we did similar things in the agriculture field, and we used the tobacco as an example. And they just plant a lot of tobaccos in the field, and also cover with a different genotype. At least a different genotype over select is primarily because we already know they have large variation in the physiological trait. And to our surprise, if we also can develop a single spectral model, then capture all the risk map like physiological trait vulnerability, regardless of the different genotype across different genotype. And then the figure here on the middle, that's the Kathleen, and that's how he brought a mobile spectral radiometer to the field, so we can use these sensors attached to a leaf, then we can get we can collect the hyperspectral reflectors, and we can later on, once the model is developed and calibrated, we can also apply to this kind of like a data. Then we can immediately estimate what's the Vmax values for this given species. But on the other hand, probably you can also imagine it works, but it's really labor intensive, right? You need to have some person to carry the sensor to the field so that you can get the information. So that's our next versions. So after prove the concept at the leaf level, later on we started to engineering another sensors in like the hyperspectral camera are mounted in a mobile system. So then we can drive the car, and then we can immediately get the hyperspectral reflectance for each individual crop. And the result shown here is we can also using this kind of system to quickly to screen the crop physiological trait as well. And later on, control, and at the same time, my team also try to think about whether we can also doing a similar system, but rather to use the mobile system, but use the drone remote sensing technique to monitor the physiology trait in melon. But we primarily focus on the crop like a natural ecosystem, but potentially can also be a test in the agriculture system as well. And so here shows the two example forest site we have in mainland China, like mountain Jin Wu and also Soybean. And these two sites we will select primarily because they have a canopy crane. So that means we can not only install a camera, hyperspectral camera on the drone, and then fly through the entire forest landscape. So then we can get the canopy scale hyperspectral data. But at the same time, we can also easily segment each individual tree crown, and also we can use the canopy crane to drive to each tree crown, and then we can sample the leaf, bring to a lab, so that we can also get the physiology trait as well. And with the pair measurement of the crown-specific hyperspectral from drone, and also the crown, like the crown-specific leaf trait based on the ground measurement, then later on we can also develop a model to see whether this kind of technique can be applied to the drone platform or not. And here shows some a preliminary result. For example, like the top right panel show here is the hyperspectral reflectance for the three like the example species, two from each side. And overall, you can tell there's not large variation in the visible light, but in the near infrared light, still have large variation across different species. And also use the pair measurement from crown-specific hyperspectral reflector and also physiology trait. We can again to see there's a convergence of models across the two sites to capture the physiological trait variability. So that also demonstrates it's entirely possible to scale up our original understanding of the leaf level to the plot level, and even nowadays using drone to an even larger spatial extent as well. And similar to this is my colleague Soybean, dating back to 2015. He also organized a field campaign in California, and they have a lot of like the plantation trees up there, like the lemon, palm, oat, grape, and so on. So then on the one hand, they organized like a hyperspectral camera in the airplane to fly through the entire landscape. And like the figure shown here, is the near infrared concept image. So the vegetation normally look like a red color, and you can see that's the image acquired from the airplane-based hyperspectral data. At the same time, use the pair measurement of the tree-specific, like the canopy spectral from the airplane, and also the physiology trait from the ground. And when they organize them together, like pair data together, and from a simple spectral model also can really well to capture the physiological trait across all different like the planting trees. And not only the model can get the model result from hyperspectral are really good, but at the same time for hyperspectral remote sensing technique, their advantage is they can also build a beautiful map, right? So you can apply the model you once trained to the entire landscape. So in that case, you can map the physiological trait variability across the entire landscape. And also you can see from like the April to June, right? The physiological trait also have a large variation, and different species also have some large variation. So using this kind of technique can potentially to resolve both the seasonal, like temporal, like seasonal dimension, and also the spatial dimensions. So by now, I use the physiological trait, like the photosynthetic capacity, as an example to demonstrate how we can use the leaf remote sensing technique until to canopy remote sensing technique, either using the near surface, like a mobile system, to drone and also into the airplane. But now if we ignore like a physiological trait to talk about more fundamental, like a biochemical trait, actually we can dating back to even earlier. For example, like a Greg Asner team from Stanford University, even in 2008, they already shows, even if we conduct one single spectral measurement, we can already predict a lot of important biochemical trait, like the SKLA here is a really important ecological trait, indicate like the thickness of leaf or the construction cost, carbon construction cost of leaf, and water content, the chlorophyll A, B, nitrogen, and phosphor, and so on. Almost most of traits are in a really accurate way. And recently, almost like 15 years after, recently, like Dr. Li Chun from David Combs' group at the Cambridge, they also found, even if we just use a single hyperspectral remote sensing, we can infer more than 21 leaf traits at the same time. So for example, the table shown on the right panel is summary all major trait you can be inferred from the hyperspectral remote sensing data. And if you just check on the R-square, and you can take, you can see more than 50% of trait can be predicted with a predict power more than 70%. That's quite impressive. And because of this, nowadays hyperspectral remote sensing was called as a high throughput phenotyping technique, because using a single measurement, it can infer a lot of really important fundamental biochemical and biophysiological traits at the same time. So further, if we see the plant in a biochemical way, and Asner et al. Using the Amazonian species as an example, they found different species. If we can construct them like the phylogenetic tree that can identify their evolution processes, right? And they found if we see it in a biochemical way, we found normally when the trees they share a similar like the evolution history, they tend to have a similar biochemical composition as well. And on the other hand, that also means different plants also have quite a distinct chemical fingerprint, as we mentioned before, right? So that's the reason. Now imagine you have a hyperspectral camera on board, like a drone or airplane, and fly through a large landscape. And using this kind of data library you build up, you can also easily tell different species apart from the landscape as well. In other words, we can also infer plant biodiversity from the space using hyperspectral remote sensing technique. So we just talk about more from the technique by the cell part. So, but how this kind of technique can contribute to the agriculture field, and below I try to use some example to demonstrate this. And the first things I would like to share whether we can use this kind of technique to contribute to the screening of the favorable crop trait, and that probably can be integrated with the modern genome engineering technique. So the theory here can dating back. The primary theoretical basis I use here is can trace back to the Dr. John Monteith's early work published in 1970s. So the general idea here is if we can got a lot of like fruiting tree, right? And then when we organize all the data together, and the axis here indicate like observed light, or we short for APA, and Y axis indicate like the gross primary productivity, or like the plant photosynthesis. And when you plot the data together, and then you find almost there's a quite near like the linear relationship, right, across all the different trees. So with this, he further conclude that energy power the crop production. And using this, he further can further highlight if we want to model the GP, we can potentially simplify as a function of APA, like the observed light multiplied by light use efficiency term, And light use efficiency term in here represent like very similar like a regression slope between absorbed light and also GBP. And we can see the light use efficiency term are quite similar across different tree, but still have some variation, right? And what determines the light use efficiency? And normally it can vary with a couple of things. One is the physiological trait, like the Vmax we just mentioned before, is a photosynthetic capacity. And it potentially can also relevant to the stress resistance trait, and definitely also the environmental response function as well. And now if we just assume a crop yield is proportional to the GBP, so with this Steve Long's team from UIUC and also his team later on published a paper to highlight if the GP are really important to the crop yield, so that means we can potentially redesigning the photosynthesis to meet the future global food demand. And one thing now, if we even just return back to this simple equation, and we can see if we want to improve the GP, there are two potential pathways. One is the APAR, right? Increase the APAR. The other one is the light use efficiency. But a lot of study nowadays already shows that it's almost not very efficient to improve the APAR. The reason is because once a crop, if they have more than 3 layers of leaf, APAR already saturated. So that means there's no much room to improve the APAR. But alternatively, that also suggests we can potentially to prioritize to engineering the light use efficiency trait, right? For example, like the Vmax, and potentially can also be applied to some like stress resistant traits. And like the technique we mentioned before, if the mobile system can be a really efficient way to screen the photosynthetic trait like the Vmax, that potentially will provide some avenue to us to screen some higher light use efficiency trait, right? And the drone technique potentially can also be used in this case. Alternatively, some other stress resistant trait, for example, like say a drought resistant trait, and then temperature resistant trait, and even like a shock resistant trait, they can potentially are also important to improve the crop yield in certain region, especially in the area and the semi-arid region, right? So then potentially the technique shown here, like the hyperspectral remote sensing, not only can be used to monitor Vmax, but potentially can also help to screen this kind of stress resistant trait as well. But more tests are still needed to do. So go beyond from the trait screening, and hyperspectral remote sensing can also contribute to the health monitor. So for example, like the figure shown here, it shows the healthy tree, healthy plant, and also unhealthy plant. And even for unhealthy plant, they probably also have different development stage. From our naked eye, we already can see their color difference, right? And hyperspectral remote sensing can provide way more information, so they can much easier to differentiate them out as well. So it can also contribute to the crop health monitoring as well. And also we can use this kind of technique to detect the nutrient deficiency. So here is a result from my colleague, Dr. Kai Guang from University of Illinois National Team. They have a really big like the crop management land in the university, and the yellow box indicate is their experimental site, and within each site, they also the digital number represent the nutrient. They have different nutrient and like the nitrogen adding levels, right, from 0 until 2015 represent a gradient. So the question here is, if we now can use the hyperspectral sensor mounted in the airplane and or even a drone fly through the entire landscape, and whether we can detect which region they are not problem with the nutrient, and which region they potentially suffer with the higher kind of like a nutrient deficiency. So the right panel is their result based on the hyperspectral predict canopy nutrient, and then the color in between red to yellow normally means they're subject to the sufficient nutrient deficiency. And now if we cross compare the two figures, and we can see all the yellow and the red regions almost map to the really low nutrient additives levels, right? So imagine now if we apply the similar technique to the real world, that potentially can help us to understand which crop they potentially suffer to the nutrient deficiency issue. And then we can use this kind of information to advise like the precision agriculture to improve crop yield in the future practice. And then here is another example I would like to share is about how to monitor crop water stress. Like we mentioned, normally hyperspectral remote sensing can also be used to monitor leaf water content. But when I checked through the literature, I found almost very few study shows we can use the hyperspectral remote sensing to monitor the water stress. And I haven't figured out the reason why, but one potential reason is if we use a drone-based hyperspectral sensors, nowadays most of sensors only have the half range, only from 400 nanometer to 900 nanometer, a spectral domain. And like we mentioned before, water absorption band are really sensitive to short-wave infrared band, right? From 1,400 nanometer until to 2,500 nanometer. And that will be really expensive. Only very few drone-based sensors can carry on that part of the spectral domain. So that probably explains why not many study using a hyperspectral remote sensing technique to monitor water stress. But there's an alternative remote sensing technique that can contribute to this field. It's called a drone-based thermal imagery technique. So for example, this is a really large crop field, and then you can have a thermal camera mounted in the drone, and then can fly through the entire landscape. And in these figures, the blue color normally means the canopy temperature of the plant, of the crop are really low, and red color indicate really high canopy temperatures. And high canopy temperature normally represent the plant under severe stress conditions. The reason is because when plant under the severe stress, normally they will choose to close the stomata. That means the less transpiration will happen, right? With less transpiration, normally the plant canopy surface temperature will be much higher. So to evaluate whether this is true, this study also compare with some like the ground measurement, primarily compare the canopy temperature and the air temperature difference. Let's represent how much like the transpiration cooling effect, and with the leaf water potential on the x-axis. Normally, leaf water potential are less negative. That means less water stress for the plant, and more negative. That means higher water stress. So then, if you now see the trend, no matter in the 9:30 in the morning or 12:30 in the afternoon, and you can tell under less water stress conditions, higher plant transpiration can cooling the canopy temperature, right? Even lead to the negative values. But when your plant have the higher water stress conditions, normally the plant will choose to close the stomata, less transpiration, and then the canopy temperature will increase sharply. So that also suggests if we have the thermal remote sensing technique, it can detect the plant water stress. And we know the temperature induced the water stress can potentially also lead to the reduction of the crop yield. So that can be another important component contribute to the precision agriculture, like to optimize the irrigation scheme so they can reduce the water stress to help to elevate the crop yield loss just because of water stress issues. But that also reminds us, even when we talk about hyperspectral remote sensing can be quite useful, but sometimes when we want to solve a real world problem like a precision agriculture, we also want to integrate multiple different sources of remote sensing technique so that it can provide an ideal solution. And the last things I would like to share is about the crop yield prediction. So even we think about we can use a drone remote sensing, a drone hyperspectral remote sensing, or even airplane hyperspectral remote sensing to monitor large-scale plant physiology, plant biochemistry, and even plant crop yield. But if we want to extend to regional scale, there's no yet satellite-based hyperspectral remote sensing technique available. So during that time, my colleague and I hypothesized whether we can use the multi-sources of the remote sensing, and especially different remote sensing platform, if they capture different spectral domain that means they represent different biophysical variables, and whether we can integrate them together to also to achieve a similar function as the hyperspectral remote sensing did it. So general hypothesis here is if we have the data collect from different sources of remote sensing, right? From like a remote sensing one, they are really good at, for example, to detect leaf other index and leaf vigors. Some probably are really good at to monitor plant photosynthesis. Some are really good at monitoring regular evapotranspiration. And they definitely will share some similar signal, but also they probably also can complement with each other. And whether we can integrate them together to help to solve the crop yield monitoring problem or not. And to address this issue, we use the data from USDA, like the ground surface, like crop yield data, and a map to the regional scale, so then we can get the like the crop yield at a crop NPP, net primary productivity at a regional scale. And here shows the result. We got the panel A shows is the like the benchmark data from the ground surveys, and then the panel B is the remote sensing when we integrate multi sources of remote sensing together and to predict the model. And overall, we can tell it captures the general shape actually quite reasonably well, and with the predict power around 82%. That suggests when there's no yet like a hyperspectral remote sensing solution from satellite, we can potentially also leverage multi sources of remote sensing to achieve a similar performance as well, especially for the crop yield monitor forecast. That actually are quite important issues. So now, if we look forward, so here just want to give a I think everyone probably already realized. Let's based on let's based on the FAO report. Now, if we just focus on like the 2020s, and we found across the world, around 30% of population actually suffer to the food insecurity issue, like severe food insecurity issues, like the dark red shown here, and also orange color is moderate food insecurity issues. So that means around 30% people still suffer to moderate to severe food insecurity issues, even in 2020. And now if we put on the temporal trend, right, and we over the time, we can see there's an increasing trend. Now, if we project them to the future, for example, with the ongoing climate change, more land probably are less favorable for the agricultural production. That means food supply can be a significant issue. At the same time, we know the population, right, at worldwide are still significantly increasing. That will demand more food. So we expect this ratio will increase in the next few decades. And particularly across the different regions, and we can see Africa suffer most, Latin America also suffer most. And even in most of Asia, we still have a long term more than 20% for insecurity issues. And how to solve these kind of issues? Jonathan Foley in 2011 proposed a potential solution on a biogeographic perspective is either we can use more land, demand more land to for the agriculture, but this is not sustainable. Or alternatively, we probably want to call for science and technology advances to improve per areas crop yield, and like the precision agriculture technique or modern genome engineering technology. So like we just mentioned, hyperspectral remote sensing potentially can be used to detect like nutrient deficiency, so it can contribute to precision agriculture part. But at the same time, hyperspectral remote sensing with high throughput phenotyping capability potentially can also be integrated with the modern genome engineering, so that we can screen some like the favorable trait to help to improve like the modern like the crop breeding technology. So that's just some thought. So at the same time, I think now we also are at a really good moment. The reason is that is over the years, now we already have a drone-based hyperspectral remote sensing increasing the share. That means if we want to use the drone technology to contribute to the precision agriculture, that's totally feasible. Meanwhile, with the accumulated data, it also can give us a lot of like underlying processes, right? And at the same time, we also now have some new opportunity from satellite part. For example, in a few months ago, like April 2022, Germany just launched a new hyperspectral satellite called MMAP. So this satellite has a 30-meter pixel size and cover almost the full spectral range from 420 to 2,450 nanometers, including 244 band. And the visit cycle is almost like 4 to 27 days, depends on the regions. And beyond the Germany, and recently, 2018, China already also launched a satellite called Golfon 5. And United States also are planning to launch another hyperspectral satellite in next 1 or 2 years. And some other countries also are planning to launch the hyperspectral satellite. That will also provide a novel opportunity to think about whether we can potentially leverage hyperspectral remote sensing from satellite to monitor the large-scale crop health, biochemistry, and physiology, even crop yield, and so on. And beyond that, is nowadays, even from the technical part, we also have an increasing maturity of the spatial and the temporal and the spectral resolution fusion algorithm. What does that mean? So imagine even now, even the hyperspectral data from satellite can be used, but their spatial resolution is a 30-meter pixel size. That means if we want to monitor like a large-scale crop, probably is fine. But if we want to use this kind of information contribute to the precision agriculture, probably is still too cost, right? Because a single pixel can be mixtured by multiple different land cover type or different crop type. So that will make it really difficult. But at the same time, over the last few years, now we already have some like a high spatial and also high temporal resolution satellite remote sensing data. For example, like the satellite data with a 3-meter and daily revisit cycles. But they doesn't have a hyperspectral band. They only have a few spectral band. So the spatial, temporal, and spectral fusion algorithm here means we can potentially fuse those 3-meter and also daily image with the hyperspectral image at satellite of the causal spatial resolution. So then we can merge them together to generate like the daily 3-meter and hyperspectral data set. This is not direct observation data, but potentially to go some algorithm. Through some algorithm, then we can get this kind of data set. It can potentially also provide some really rich data set to contribute to the precision agriculture field as well. And lastly, if we want to solve the food security problem, it is quite highly interdisciplinary. So it not need the remote sensing support. It also need a lot of like a field and also like underlying like a genome and also biological knowledge. And from if we want to not only from understanding the current status and also monitoring current status to go beyond to make the future like a food security policy, then we potentially also want to use the computer models, right, to forecast different management practice and what's their potential feedback and how the future climate change can potentially affect the crop yield. So then we also want to collaborate with the scientists working on the numerical modeling part as well. So it's a highly interdisciplinary research and also need. So I think that's the reason today I primarily from remote sensing part to share some of my perspective. Probably most of them are not exactly precise, but I think more conversation are needed to have a more conversation collaboration so that we can collectively to solve this kind of important problem we are going to face in this century. So here is a quick summary about what we I just shared over the past 1 hour. First, give a brief introduction about the hyperspectral remote sensing, and then use the plant photosynthesis as an example to demonstrate how hyperspectral remote sensing can be a scalable and accurate means for characterizing plant physiological trait vulnerability across genotype, across environment and seasons. And also give some example to see how we can use the hyperspectral remote sensing for a crop trait screening, crop health monitoring, and even crop yield prediction. I look forward. We need to be more collaborative. And with this, I would like to acknowledge some funding source to support my research and also my research team at the HKU. And also would like to thank you again for everyone, and thank Professor Lam for giving me such a great opportunity to share my work today. Yeah, thank you. If I have time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jin Wu. So before we take on the questions, I would suggest us to take a photo first. So could you first stop sharing the screen so that we can see most of the faces?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so please turn on your camera and take a photo together with Professor Jin Wu. Thank you very much. I think it's a very exciting technology. So it's a non-destructive technology and time saving, because as a biologist, we go to the field and sampling real plant and break it into pieces and extract the chemicals and measure. But now it seems like that you can just take a photo and get all the information, right? So it's very exciting. So maybe we start to entertain questions from the audience. So I think George has a question. So George, can you just unmute yourself and talk? George.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Wu. Great talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. My question is, could this technology be applied to the monitoring of mangrove forests? And say, for example, in Hong Kong, we have 8 true mangroves and a few dozen mangrove associates. Is it possible to apply this technology to monitor the health and the distribution of mangroves in Hong Kong or other parts of China? Thank you.
Thanks so much, George. That's a really great question. In theory, yes. Actually, hyperspectral remote sensing can also be used to monitor the species and even biochemical composition of the mangrove forest. So, for example, like the Stephen Zhang from Hong Kong U, and his team already used some like the Gotham 5, right, hyperspectral remote sensing data, try to map the Hong Kong mangroves, and it shows there's some potential to improve. At the same time, I think George Lee used to work with Professor Fen Tong, right, from the CUHK. Last year, they also have one paper published in remote sensing environment. It shows they can use the drone-based hyperspectral remote sensing system, very similar like I showed in my talk. And they fly through the Maple in Hong Kong. And they can also use that to detect the species composition quite well in Hong Kong. So I guess this is entirely possible. But I think probably the challenge is, for example, now, if we have the hyperspectral data in Hong Kong, right, using the imagery from Hong Kong, and also collect some data, for example, say from Hainan or even from Xiamen, also have mangroves, and whether there's some like a generalizable approach across different regions or not. I think that probably are not clear, but wait for some like more tests. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to use this technology to monitor some moving objects, for example, bird migrations in Asia?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think probably a little bit challenging because most of remote sensing data, right? Most of remote sensing data, they probably they are not like a video camera, right? They are not like a video camera to continue monitor some region. They probably is a snapshot, right? So if for the moving object, then probably is a little bit challenging. But I know, for example, some people they try to use the stable isotopic technique to monitor the bird migration, right? Because, for example, if you can get some photo from the bird, right, in different regions, then you can check what's their underlying like the isotopic signatures, then you can identify where they potentially come from. So if we can do it in that way, so that means if we can get the bird further information and to do some hyperspectral measurement, then potentially we can also trace where they immigrate. I think that's a really creative ideas. We need to do more tests.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hey, Albert.
Yeah, my question is that it's very impressive mapping. Every time I go to California, I'm always worried about the California mountain fire. I do think that your technology can actually give some grade about, hey, this mountain is not kosher. This is really going to burst in the frame. Could you be able to do that and do it with a reasonable like prediction of like, okay, within these 5 days, the climate is like this, and the ignition point is we're going to come to that. And my lovely brother is living in California. I always worry about him. I always pray for him, right? Like just so that I can tell him, like, Joe, get out of your house, run.
That's a really creative idea and also suggestion. I guess now we already have a lot of tools to monitor the fire, but I think when we can early warning, for example, say before the fire happening, like a few days in advance to predict, to give people some warning, right? Early warning signal to say, oh, the fire can potentially happen. I think we're not quite sure. So for example, nowadays we already know once the fire happened, for example, the albedo will change, like the reflectant, right? Originally they are vegetation. Now if you burn, that means the color will change to black, right? So some like the optical remote sensing are really sensitive to monitor that. At the same time, we know when a fire happened, the surface temperature will increase. So the thermal remote sensing also can contribute. But now you are totally right. If we want to see, for example, if we understand some underlying processor to link the early like ignition status to the fire event, for example, say they have
Because
more.
I still remember some of your map. You actually map out whether the plant have enough water, right? So I would say that when you really can map and hey, this is quite dry, right? You know.
Right. So I guess if we can know some underlying processes, for example, say when the leaf water content is underneath certain level, or when the air temperature is beyond certain levels, and then also we have a technique to long-term like monitor their time series change, then potentially can help to develop some like early warning signal. But I'm not that in that field, so sorry I cannot answer the question really well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so there's a question from Haidong. He has a sleeping baby, so I will read out his questions to you, right? So he asked whether intercropping will affect the results because they may have different kinds of plants intercrop to each other. That's the first question. And the second question is, we want to identify whether some sites in Hong Kong are really active or abandoned farmland. Is it possible to just fire a drone using remote sensing? And how would the cost when compared to really go there and do the field study? So there are two questions.
That's a great question. So I think the first thing is whether, for example, like intercropping will affect, like I guess the result, like the phenotyping technique, like the biochemical, biophysiological trait prediction, right? So I think in theory, the model, once the model is well calibrated, it also can be applied to the intercropping conditions. But I think, for example, if you didn't originally in your model, when you develop, for example, like we developed in the University of Illinois Champaign, right, for 6 genotype, and if you want to directly apply that model to the intercropping conditions, I think probably the model will break down. And we recently have a general hypothesis here is as long so kind of like we can think about in this way, everything we can measure are kind of like a phenotype, right? They subject to a genotype and also the environmental conditions, including the hyperspectral remote sensing by itself, actually are also a phenotype. So that means if we can have the sufficient like the library to constrain the sources of the cause of the phenotype of the body, then the model potentially can be generalizable. And it also depends on the trait by itself. For one example I can share here is 2 years ago, we have another paper in New Phytologist. So we collect the data just in the New England region in the United States. For example, like the Massachusetts and until to the and Maine, these kind of regions. And we just train the spectral and also the train models in that region. And later on, we have the new data set connect from Arctic, from California, and from tropical region. And we found the model overall, it works really well. But it also depends on some model, I guess. Yeah. And then for you, second question to say, if we can use a remote sensing technique to identify some like to differentiate the active and abandoned farmland. In theory, if we can, because I'm not in this field, but if you can tell me, for example, say what's the primary potential difference between the active and farmland and also the abandoned farmland in terms of, for example, the productivity, like the canopy structure and so on. And I think we can either using the existing remote sensing technique to tell them apart, or we can also definitely can also try with drone-based hyperspectral remote sensing. And in terms of price, so for example, now if you want to contract with a company to help you to fly a drone-based hyperspectral, right? In terms of like a 500 meter by 500 meter region, and I think the price is around 20 to 30,000 Hong Kong dollars per set, something like this. So I think hope this can answer your question to somehow. Yeah.
Okay. So Amos, your question.
Oh yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Jen. Good to see you again here.
Hey,
and yeah, so hold on for a second. Sorry for that. Yeah, so it appears, of course, to me that the remote sensing enabled monitoring can really help gather loads of data, right? Like to help build statistical or machine learning model for short-term forecasts. Like, oh, if there is like a drought coming, and then you can kind of tell how the plants are doing, and then that would be good for precision farming, right? But for the kind of models that we typically use for, say, within Earth system model or within, or they're usually larger scale, like predicting crop yield for maybe like multi-decadal timescales, or at least a few years beyond, and looking at how climate change can affect a particular region. So there's still like a mismatch between these very detailed remote sensing based monitoring and the Earth system kinds of application to predict crop or agricultural development over a larger spatial temporal scale. So in your opinion, how can we really talk in a sense, like how do we, like Earth system developers, model developer, can really benefit from this kind of very detailed monitoring?
That's a very good question, and also very challenging questions. Yeah, I think the more conversation between remote sensing scientists and also modeler probably are needed, right? But I think at least I think there are a few things potentially we can do, right? One thing is remote sensing are really good is provide some important parameters, right? So model also need some parameter. For example, if you want to run the global like agricultural forecast, at least you need to know where is what type of crop, right? Where they distribute, and what's the crop trait, and all this kind of information actually potentially can be derived from remote sensing, right? And secondly, I guess remote sensing can also provide some important benchmark as well to evaluate the model. For example, if you can use the model to do the simulation, and then probably from a model perspective, we can simulate, like for example, like a productivity, right? But now remote sensing also have a lot like the proxy of the productivity. They can capture the spatial dimension of the productivity variation. So whether the model output like productivity will agree with the remote sensing derived or not, I think that's also another way to evaluate whether the model makes sense or not, right? And follow on, we know from all different kind of generation of remote sensing up to now. So now I think the longest remote sensing data now we have close to the 5 decades now, right? So that means during the last 5 decades, some like for example, some climate change impact on the crop yield or crop productivity, or even for the forest productivity already show up, right? So we can use long-term data to see the climate change impact. So whether the key issue is now if you want to forecast the future, use a system model to forecast the future, like a project, what's the end, what will happen by the end of this century. So probably you can just simulate a model in the 50 years overlap with remote sensing first to see how good they can overlap. So I think a lot of things potentially can be done. And the last thing is I still want to say is like me, my background is plant ecophysiology, and I try to see what's the fundamental mechanism, right, underlying using the remote sensing to see, and also try to see whether we can convert this kind of a fundamental ecophysiological mechanism into a mathematical equation. So that potential, once be found, potential can also be coded in the models to operate certain components as well, right? So that's just some thought, but I think more conversation needed almost. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Mike, John, you want to ask the question?
So I read Mike's question?
Yeah, yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Mike just test a message us in the Zoom chat. So the question is remote sensing a quick screening method to study or review what the plant grow along well, their relation such as comparison with competitors or both or others? So remote sensing, yeah, I think remote sensing can be a screening method. Can be a screening method to see, even using the existing genotype, like a mutation, right, of a plant, and then to see what plant will do well. I think remote sensing can provide this kind of quick screening methods. But at the same time, I guess if we believe, for example, say remote sensing can provide, it's kind of like a phenotype, and then fundamental. The phenotype can be determined by genotype and also environment condition, including the competitor, right? If that's the general theoretical framework. So as long as I think if we have sufficient experiment to get this kind of like pair measurement, then potentially we can help to answer these questions and also help to understand which genotype under which environmental conditions they potentially can perform better. And before that, I think we also need to be too optimistic, right? So because a lot of regular training are needed in the beginning, right? Like a pair measurement in the beginning probably are also needed in the beginning. And once the model is well calibrated, and in longer term, potentially we can achieve the goal like you just mentioned here.
So, yeah, Professor Wu, I think your remote sensing system is very good for early warning. So, for example, there's a drought problem or overheat or invasion by insects or weeds. So, I believe that the remote sensing may be able to give you early warning, especially in a big area that the farmer may not go there every day. So, but I have some question about the monitoring of the yield, because I just wonder. So, when you model the yield, do you model the parts that will be products, or you model the whole plant? For example, I work on soybean, right? So we only care how much soybean seeds we got. So we don't care about the rest, right? So if you just model the biomass, then the yield may not be accurate. So has that been factoring in? So what part of the plants are actually the food?
Professor Lang, I think that's a really great question. So we know, for example, the crop yield, from remote sensing perspective, we can definitely easily monitor the above ground biomass really easy, right? Because that is that the remote sensing can see, right? For example, if a crop they have the higher canopy height, on a higher leaf index, normally suggests they potentially have a higher dry biomass, right? But convert from the higher dry biomass to the crop yield, sometimes we also have some Harvey index, right? And the Harvey index can vary from genotype to genotype, and also can vary from different environmental conditions. So I think sometimes if we didn't know clearly about the Harvey index, then probably even if we can use remote sensing technique to monitor the above ground biomass, it not necessarily will lead to accurate prediction about the crop yield, right? And alternatively is if we by now we are still not quite sure whether hyperspectral remote sensing can be a potential solution to also predict the Harvey index or not, because I didn't see any publication by now. But I know my friend Kai Guang from UIUC, they try to do that, but I didn't see any publication yet. So I think it's probably still a quite challenging problem by now. And from the modeling perspective, I think now what they did is they can use remote sensing to identify different crop type, and then they use the ground survey data about the Harvey index, and then use plus the crop type, so then they can interpret into the large scale. So that's how they did it. And last thing is about the remote sensing part. I think it depends. For example, if you use a drone-based remote sensing, then they can probably help to understand, help to monitor like an individual organ, right? For example, like individual plant, individual crop. But normally, if we want to use the satellite remote sensing, then it will be challenging because their spatial resolution are much closer. Then probably they can only give us like the patch level or plot level, like average status. So it depends on the different platform and the different detail can be provided.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So my last question from me. So many people are very conscious about carbon dioxide emissions and carbon dioxide sink like in the forest. So would it be a simple application by the remote sensing to accurately estimate the carbon dioxide release or the sinking of the carbon dioxide to the forest to estimate how good or bad that we are doing in reducing carbon dioxide?
Right. Now we already have some remote sensing, for example, like a satellite-based like chlorophyll fluorescence, right? Like sun-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, short for SEP, right? So now we already over the last 5 years, this is a hot topic in the remote sensing field because people found they can use the hyperspectral satellite from the hyperspectral satellite, right, data to infer the SEP and the solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence. And the SEP are tightly relevant to the plant photosynthesis. That means we can doesn't rely on any like the other measurement or doesn't rely on any like a model. We can directly use the satellite to approximate the photosynthesis across the entire landscape, right? So I think that's possible. But I think in terms of net carbon, right, like exactly like carbon, sometimes it's challenging because the carbon by itself for any kind of ecosystem, it not only have the photosynthesis, right? That probably can be monitored by like the satellite-based, like I said. But for the ecosystem, they also have the respiration. Respiration can be from plants and can be from the soil. And that part will be quite challenging to monitor. And alternatively, there's another satellite called the OCO2 from the NASA, from the United States, that can monitor the entire like vertical like the volume of the atmosphere. They can give you a precise value about the CO2 concentration of that. But from that data to convert to a segment like the photosynthesis respiration, and I think a lot of models are still needed because if you convert into the gases, that means they are potentially can be mobile, right? Can be transported from one location to another location, and there are also biochemical underlying. So that means need to have the model and data integrated approach to assess that. It's also an active field, but still a lot of uncertainty underlying. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor.
Is any other last minute question from the audience? So if I don't see any, I will make use of this time to do some advertisement for our next talk. So Katrin, could you advertise the next talk to the audience?
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
So Katrin, maybe I introduce the next talk. Thank you, Professor Jin Wu. So the next talk will be a very different topic because here we don't only focus on technology, but we also want to do business. So Dr. Howard Link, who has been working on social entrepreneurship for a long time, so he would give a talk on the topic when social entrepreneurship meets science. So when we have science technology, how it can be converted to social enterprise, and he will share his experience. I think it is good not only for friends in Hong Kong, but also friends in other areas who would like to develop business to help the society. So the next talk will be on August 10 at 6 p.m. Hong Kong time. So if you're interested, you can scan the QR code to register, and we'll also send out the link for registration soon in the future. So I guess it's late for the friends in Hong Kong, right? Dinner time. so if we have no more questions, let's friends Professor Jin Wu again, and hopefully we'll see you again in our next talk.